Welcome back, disciples. I hope you enjoyed meeting Alypius and Nebridius this past week, and I hope that this triptych of sorts about the people we encounter in our lives, as Augustine did in his, our parents, our false friends, and our true friends, has given you some tools for thinking about the network of spiritual influences, good, bad, and indifferent, that you live and move in. But now we're going to move on from this mini-series on the people in our lives and proceed to another mini-series on the big ideas in our lives, the principles we hold about what is real and how the spiritual world works. So, on to this week's topic, Augustine's journey through various philosophies on the way to Christianity. As I've said before, as he entered his late teens and was studying in Carthage, Augustine made the choice to dedicate time and mental effort to finding a religious, philosophical structure that made sense of the world to him. This change in Augustine's priorities happened rather suddenly. He had already been grappling with the problem of evil and what its nature and origin is. He knew this was the big question that the religion he ultimately chose would have to answer. He instinctively knew that God had to be supreme, unchanging, and unchangeable, but he only knew materialistic ways to think about things that exist. He had no concept of non-material, pure spiritual substances. For Augustine, God had to be some kind of stretched out being that covered the world like a canopy and also penetrated right down through everything like nothing else we can conceive of. But what to do about evil? By the end of his philosophical journey, he knew he couldn't attribute evil to God, which would make God not all good, and he couldn't admit a distinct principle of evil apart from God, which would make God not all-powerful. Not to mention, his concept of evil was limited to having some kind of materiality, just like his concept of God. But here at the beginning, Augustine would still be willing to entertain a concept of evil as a distinct principle, once he had been convinced to give any time to philosophy at all. As a teenager, as you might have guessed by now, he couldn't be bothered. All there was to him was his career in rhetoric, social advancement, and hedonism. All that changed sometime during his studies at Carthage, when he was between 16 and 19. He was reading through the standard handbooks on public speaking and happened upon an unrelated work by the Roman author Cicero, the Hortensius. Now, as of the year 2025, this text is lost, and only fragments of it survive, most of them from Augustine quoting it in various places. Personally, I refuse to believe it's gone forever. I'm sure there is a manuscript somewhere that still has it, and we will rediscover it someday. What we know of the topic of this dialogue of Cicero's was, is philosophy worth it? If all the different philosophers disagree with each other on the most fundamental elements of philosophy, and so many of them use fancy rhetoric to mask that their ideas are empty, why should anyone bother with it? We know Cicero's defense of the value of philosophy literally changed Augustine's life, though it's a shame we can't describe exactly how anymore. Mindful of his upbringing and his mother's convictions, when Augustine set off to find a philosophy that would answer his questions and meet his expectations, he turned first to Scripture. He wrote it off almost immediately as useless. Its plain-spoken literary style was far from Ciceronian, and Augustine doubted anything so written for a mass audience could contain deep, profound truths. Not to mention the narratives he read there, though clearly he started with Genesis or Judges or something like that, were the opposite of morally edifying. and he was frankly offended that anyone would think a true philosophy could be found in those books. He promptly tossed them aside. Now, quickly to recap his biography, during the 12 or 13 years between 371 and 383, Augustine spent the first 2 or 3 years in Carthage studying, the next 2 or 3 in Tagaste teaching, and the last 7 or 8 back in Carthage teaching. For 9 of those years, beginning during his first stay in Carthage and ending very shortly before he moved to Rome, Augustine settled into a religion that he was sure contained the best explanation for the existence of evil. This religion was Manichaeism. Its founder was named Mani, and its members were called Manichees. Mani was a Persian in the mid-200s, from a background of Christians who had not yet detached themselves finally from Judaism. He claimed to have received visual and audible revelations as a young adult, and positioned himself as both Moses' promised last prophet and Jesus' promised paraclete. The theory he proposed of the creation of the universe was the latest in a series of mystery cults that incorporated Jesus into a larger genealogy of gods, spirits, powers, ethers, and elements. Each cult had its own variant of the bewildering web of supernatural relationships, but all employed the same names and principles for the same purpose: to explain how one single good, wise mind produced a harmonious throng of powers and virtues in the heavenly realm, and how rogue powers shattered that harmony and dragged other spirits down into the sub-heavenly mess of chaotic matter that enmeshed them all. To put it flippantly, it's a fall of the angels on steroids. And in this version, the universe is created first by the fall of the angels itself, and then by the efforts of the fallen to build for themselves, to spite the original heavenly mind. Manichaeism thus taught a principle of evil that had substance to its existence, and an original mind that was not omnipotent. Augustine was persuaded by its argument that evil is a force with its own existence that abides in conflict with a comparable force of good, and he was captivated by the sophistication of its supernatural genealogy. Manichaeism and all the earlier mystery cults share the label of Gnostic religions, because organizationally, they all imply a series of private ritual initiations for their members, greater detail, gnosis, about the genealogies and the methods available to their members to escape their muddied bodiliness and retrieve the pure supernatural within as it was first created by the original mind. These were revealed gradually and in greater detail to members as they underwent each initiation. Ever unwilling to commit to a religion so definitively as to receive full orders, in our Catholic jargon, Augustine stayed a hearer of Manichaeism for all 9 years of his membership, never pursuing full election. He continued to explore the writings of other Latin philosophers, and I should note that in ancient times, the great philosophers were just as much scientists, especially in astronomy, as they were abstract thinkers. Augustine started to find these natural philosophers' positions more persuasive. If they were so careful and detailed about their scientific studies, why shouldn't they be the same in their logic and metaphysics? Besides, Augustine had a side interest in astrology and horoscopes, too, and he came to find the Manichaean system particularly out of step with those. Now, for all the time he'd been a Manichae, he'd heard people praising to the skies a certain Faustus, who had taken the step of leaving his family and undergoing full Manichaean initiation. He was supposed to be the greatest explainer of Manichaean doctrine, and Augustine presumed that if he could meet with Faustus, all these problems could be resolved. Well, when Augustine was 28, Faustus finally came to Carthage. He was a handsome man of a certain age. His speech was smooth, and he had a natural sense for public speaking. But he never really seemed to say anything. Several times Augustine got an invite through a friend to a private gathering with Faustus, and then he realized that this great genius had never actually studied logic or the sciences. He was self-taught in a few writings of the basic Latin philosophers, and that was all. To his credit, Faustus knew which topics he'd have to politely refuse to address, since he knew how little he knew about them. So Augustine was not taken in by Faustus, as so many others were, and he pretty immediately stopped participating in Manichaeism and searched for wisdom elsewhere. A grace for which he later thanked God and saw as part of his return to Christianity. But ironically, in that period of his life, his break from the Christianized dualism of the Manichees had meant that he doubted any substantial truth could be found in true Christianity either. A year later, at most, Augustine moved to Rome. He moved in with a local Manichee at first while he was getting his feet on the ground there, but he mostly did not attend their services. Now in the hometown of the philosopher who started him on this path, Cicero, Augustine experimented for a while with that school of philosophy, academic skepticism. On this model, one should never be too quick to make truth claims about something that hasn't been sufficiently demonstrated to them yet as being fully understood and accounted for. Not that it's impossible to make truth claims, but that one should do a lot of due diligence before making each claim. In Augustine's mental state of being let down by the religion he had belonged to for nearly 10 years, this skeptical approach suited him well. But he didn't stay in this philosophy nearly as long as he had in Manichaeism, probably only about 2 or 3 years. After moving to Milan and studying under the Bishop Ambrose, he started on the path through Neoplatonism that would finally satisfy his difficulties with the problem of evil and set him up to embrace Christianity as the most perfect and true philosophy. But this video is getting long enough, so I'll save all of that for our next video about Ambrose. For this week's reading, I'm trying something different. We're not going to read about these philosophical questions from what Augustine writes in Confessions this week. I've already condensed that and given it to you in this video. Instead, I'm giving you a taste of a different genre of Augustine's writing, the treatise. This is a sustained and organized argument in favor of one side of a disputed question, usually framed as a letter to some other Christian who has asked for Augustine's advice on the matter. The topic of this treatise technically is continence, the virtue of resisting the sexual demands of the flesh, overpowering them with your rational will. But along the way, Augustine steps back to consider the flesh itself, and whether we can say the flesh is good, and whether its situation has changed between the creation and the fall. Augustine wrote this treatise during a period when he was being accused by some of still holding some Manichaean beliefs that he had never fully purged. Remember, in Manichaeism, fallen spirits are enmeshed, trapped, webbed in chaotic matter, and the materiality of their flesh is part and parcel of the chaotic non-heavenliness of the realm that they fall into. So by lingering over this question of the goodness of the flesh, Augustine means to prove he's not still a Manichaean, for they would have rejected this position. Obviously, a different sort of reading like this one requires a different sort of questions to consider as you read. I imagine you won't have had much exposure to philosophy about the intrinsic goodness of human embodiment before either. So all I'm asking you to do this time is A. Highlight the sentences or phrases that strike you as being the main points Augustine wants to make. B. Notice how Augustine uses the scriptures to illustrate his points, and whether it makes you see old, familiar Bible passages in a new light. And C. Just pick out the most confusing passages to you, to see if another group member was able to make something of it. Your facilitators are not trained philosophers, so don't expect them to have clear explanations available. And don't be shy to work through them together as best you can. One last note about the reading. This text was translated by a different person than our Confessions translator, and apparently this translator wasn't interested in putting in paragraph breaks. I am sorry to you all. Please understand that I didn't make that choice, and I don't like it either. So until next week, peace and all good.